Hello, everyone. I am Bobby Eichler, wildlife biologist for District 7 out of LaGrange. Today, I will be going over 3 of the 7 wildlife management practices that are covered in the comprehensive guidelines. I will cover habitat management, erosion control, and predator control. Afterwards, Megan will cover providing supplemental shelter, water, food, and census counts. Megan and I will discuss possible practices that may apply to your property in each category. Listed here are the 7 major practices that I mentioned previously. It is important to note that as a landowner participating in the wildlife valuation process, you are required at a minimum to complete at least one practice from 3 different categories on an annual basis. You may go over the 3 practices annually, which is fine. Just make sure you cover at least 3 of the listed categories. Also, please note that many of the practices that we will cover today will have intensity levels. It is your responsibility to know the intensity levels that are covered in your region's comprehensive guidelines. The website listed will bring you to the website. Simply scroll down, look at the map of Texas, and decide which ecoregion you're in. From there, choose the respective guidelines. When writing your plan and deciding which practices to implement, there are a few simple questions that will help you decide. 1. What is the current status of the property? So is your property located in part of the county that is predominantly and historically prairie country, or maybe are you in the area that's more wooded, that's more representative of the post oak savanna? Number 2, what are the goals and what animals do you want to target? Do you want to hunt these animals? Do you just want to watch? Are you a bird watcher? Uh, you may even want to just restore historical plant communities. Number 3, what do the target animals require to thrive? For example, if you want to manage for grassland species of birds, then you will need to manage for open habitats that preferably have adequate amounts of grassy cover. And then number 4, what management practices will meet your goals and help the targeted animals, once again, thrive and do well. While adequate amounts of grass may help grassland birds, exotic grasses oftentimes have very little value. In this case, you may want to restore areas back to native grasses, which can be covered under several categories. As Megan and I go through the presentations, we will try to give brief explanations of many of the practices. Ideally, you would have a template of the wildlife management plan in front of you so that you can mark any of the practices that you feel you can achieve. Once completed, you will likely have quite a few practices listed. It is best to turn in a plan with maybe 4 or 5 really good practices that benefit the wildlife and are easy to document. You are always welcome to complete additional practices, but we discourage you from turning in a plan with every possible practice marked. Once again, the link shown at the bottom will bring you to a site in which you can download a template of the plan. Simply scroll down towards the bottom of the website. So, as we get into the wildlife management practices, it is important to note that many of the tenets of wildlife management are based on 5 simple management categories, first mentioned by Aldo Leopold. Leopold was a forester who then became a professor at the University of Wisconsin, and he is considered the father of wildlife management. His quote here mentions the axe, cow, plow, fire, and gun. These 5 implements can have negative effects when used incorrectly, such as too much land clearing and timber removal, overgrazing by livestock, too much conversion to farming, indiscriminate use of fire, and overharvesting of wildlife. But when used in moderation, these same implements can have beneficial uses such as proper forestry and farming techniques, proper grazing, prescribed use of fire, and regulated hunting. When viewing the Wildlife Management Plan template, there are 10 practices listed under the Habitat Management section as listed here. Grazing can have a very beneficial effects when applied properly and within proper stocking rates. Prairie ecosystems have historically been maintained by 2 driving forces, grazing and fire. Oftentimes when we meet with new landowners, they mention never wanting to have livestock on their property again if they can help it. Once again, some grazing is beneficial on an annual basis, so at the least I encourage you to maintain your fences with your neighbors and have some gates installed between you and the neighbors. While it may not be worth your time having your own herd of livestock, this will enable you to work with your neighbor and possibly let the livestock graze periodically on your property. The grazing and the hoof action can stimulate new growth and help diversify the plant community. Livestock can also be used to clean up woodlands that may be getting rank, as well as also provide new growth on the browse for white-tailed deer. Using livestock as a tool could fit under several systems as listed on the Wildlife Management Plan template. Rest from grazing is also important and enables more desirable grass species to possibly germinate and to grow in areas that have been overgrazed in the past. Your local biologist can assist you with the basics of proper grazing and rest periods. Allowing rest can allow for desirable grasses to populate an area, but undesirable brush will need to be kept in check as well. Here you will see an area that after rest had native little bluestem come in, but also some brush species grew as well. As mentioned earlier, fire was an important part of both the prairie ecosystem as well as the post oak savanna and oak prairie systems. Many of our woodlands today are choked out by yaupon and cedar in the understory due to generations of fire suppression. Prescribed fire needs adequate planning in order to assure adequate fuel loads as well as to ensure a safe burn. Just a few of the benefits of prescribed fire include removing thatch, stimulating plant growth, and setting back brush species. Your local biologist can assist you with planning for a prescribed fire, and many parts of the state have prescribed burn associations made up of landowners. Prescribed burn associations can assist you with providing equipment and manpower once you become an active member. Range enhancement is the establishment of native herbaceous plants into an existing pasture or hayfield situation. Oftentimes, this involves the removal of non-natives or exotic grasses such as Bermuda, Bahia, or several of the old world varieties of bluestem such as KR or Clayburgh bluestem. This practice can be quite expensive, so guidance and assistance from a natural resource agency such as Texas Parks and Wildlife, Texas AgriLife, or the Natural Resources Conservation Service is encouraged. The key to this practice is that native species of grasses and forbs are planted. There is an intensity level requirement for this practice, which is 10% of the total area designated in the plan, or 10 acres, whichever is less. Additionally, depending on the locality of the property, there may be assistance programs available to help defray some of the input costs, so check with your local biologist on that. Lastly, this practice should not be confused with planting food plots, which are normally annual plants grown in either the summer or winter months. This practice would fall under providing supplemental foods and food plots in Section 5 of the plan. Brush management is likely one of the most common practices used towards the wildlife management valuation. It seems whether a woodland or a prairie, fighting brush is a constant. This practice also has an annual intensity level of 10 acres or 10% of the total area designated in the plan, whichever is less. Brush management projects may use mechanical, chemical, or biological methods. Some examples of brush management would include any of the following. Number one, spraying weesach or mesquite that has invaded a pasture. This may also be accomplished mechanically. Number two, mulching yaupon understory in a stand of post oak or live oak. This may also use basal spraying to accomplish yaupon removal. And then number three, while most people think of removing brush as brush control, reestablishing brush may also be used. For example, if you have a pasture along a creek that regularly floods, replanting native trees on this acreage could be used towards brush management. Lastly, brush control can be an ongoing process. Mulching a yaupon understory and not having a follow-up plan result in another yaupon thicket in just a matter of years. Follow-up maintenance is a must in most brush control situations. Using chemical control prior to mechanical control can remedy much of the resprouting. Fence modification is listed in the Wildlife Management Plan on page 3, but it is not a practice that is actually listed in the comprehensive guidelines for most ecoregions in Texas. The only comprehensive guidelines this practice is found in is for the Trans-Pecos region of Texas. As you will see on the plan, it is mostly intended in areas with pronghorn antelope or bighorn sheep. Both of these species rarely jump, and fencing can restrict their movements and will serve as a barrier. If you are in a different ecoregion of Texas and you feel your existing net wire fence is hindering movements of wildlife, check with your appraisal staff to determine if this practice may work for you. I would carefully weigh the benefits and risk of removing net fencing, since it can be helpful in hindering feral hogs from coming onto your property. Riparian management involves protecting the vegetation and soils in riparian areas. Riparian zones are basically the low areas on either side of a stream. We often refer to them as creek bottoms. Riparian management includes removing livestock from these areas either seasonally or year-round and often involves fencing when livestock is present on the property. At times, reestablishing vegetation along the corridor is needed, as in the picture here. A riparian corridor should be at least 100 yards wide or 50 yards per side of the creek in order to best protect the soils and the water quality. Wetland management or enhancement consists of providing seasonal or permanent water for roosting, feeding, or nesting habitat for wetland wildlife. These practices include creating shallow wetlands, oftentimes referred as moist soil impoundments, which normally have seasonal water depths averaging 18 inches, mainly in the fall and winter. Once established, these impoundments should have limited access by livestock so that wetland plant species can grow through the summer and provide a food source for waterfowl during the fall and winter. For the most part, wetland management involves shallow impoundments or, at a minimum, exposed banks of deeper impoundments that are left to vegetate over the summer. Well-manicured stock ponds, while beneficial at times to wintering waterfowl, are generally not considered wetland management. Construction and maintenance of wetland units can qualify as a multi-year practice and can qualify for up to 10 years. Species of concern are defined in the comprehensive guidelines as endangered, threatened, or rare species. In portions of the lower post oak savanna and Lost Pines area of Texas, Houston toad would fall into this category. In the Edwards Plateau regions, golden-cheeked warbler and black-capped vireo would be examples. Within the comprehensive guidelines, there are multiple practices that may fall under management practices for species of concern, most of which overlap with other practices in the wildlife management plan. Practices may include fencing out natives or exotics, brush management, regulated grazing, and various other practices. If you choose this category, I suggest you work closely with your local biologist and appraiser to ensure you're working with a species of concern and that your practices will benefit. The practice of prescribed control of native, exotic, or feral species can include controlling both vegetation and animal species. Earlier in the presentation, I mentioned range enhancement. Oftentimes prior to reseeding, the current vegetation needs to be killed out. So, if native grass restoration is a goal, then at least 1 year needs to go towards applying herbicide to the area to be replanted so that exotics such as Bahia or Bermuda may be brought under control. Reclaiming areas that have been overtaken by exotic species such as McCartney rose and tallow tree, or by native species such as huisache, mesquite, or red cedar would fall under this category as well. When removing vegetation under this category, the intensity level is 10% of the designated area in the plan, or 10 acres, whichever is less. When it comes to wildlife species, the management of white-tailed deer to keep them within carrying capacity of the property can fall under this practice, but this may be difficult on small acreage. The control of feral hogs is a beneficial practice that can either fall under the habitat management part of the plan within this practice of prescribed control of exotics, or it can also fall under the predator control section on page 6. I will discuss feral hogs more in depth a few slides down the road. The practice of wildlife restoration is a practice that would involve proper permitting. Landowners cannot legally trap and relocate wildlife species without proper permits in place. This practice may be used on a plan as a part of a larger reintroduction plan when cooperating with the state. In the past, both white-tailed deer and wild turkeys have been stocked on a county-wide basis across much of the state. For the most part, this is a practice that is used very little at the current time. One current example may be the release of Houston toadlets on properties enrolled with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service within their historical range and habitat. The second category on the wildlife management plan is erosion control. Don't worry, this section will not take near as long as the habitat control section. Several practices, as listed here, fall under this category. It is important to note that most of these practices are 10-year practices, meaning once established, the practice will count as a 10-year practice, but some annual maintenance will likely be required. These practices are normally larger projects, so I recommend checking with your local tax appraisal staff to make sure the practice is adequate. While erosion control is very important, proper erosion control should take place early to prevent large-scale future problems. Small-scale preventative measures may not count towards a 10-year practice, but as you see a need for preventative measures, check with your appraisal staff to maybe get a credit for a shorter period. I will briefly go over a few of these practices, but not all. Pond construction or major repair of a permanent pond to prevent, stop, or control erosion is an acceptable project. When designing such projects, it is advisable to create these ponds to provide beneficial wildlife habitat when possible. Gully shaping is an important practice to prevent ongoing soil and water issues. Past overgrazing is likely the #1 reason for current gully issues. Gully shaping often involves heavy equipment, contouring, and reestablishing vegetation. For large-scale issues, contact your local Natural Resource Conservation Service office for their technical expertise. Part 3 of the Wildlife Management Plan is predator control. Predator control should involve a comprehensive plan and strategy if this is one of your practices. Simply driving around occasionally and hoping to see a feral hog to shoot at does not fulfill this practice. Dedicated hunting times and effort, however, could count. You will see here several species that could fall under predator control. Feral hog and fire ant control seems to be practices that are used most often. I will cover those in more detail here in a second. I would be very hesitant about feral dog and cat control on small acreage. The occasional neighbor's dog or cat crossing your property does not fall into this category. While feral cats and dogs can cause serious issues to wildlife and livestock, they should truly be feral and not just your neighbor's pets. Issues with domesticated pets should be taken care of through your county sheriff's department. If using predator control as a qualifying practice for species on this list such as mesomammals, coyotes, and bobcats, a well-planned and scheduled trapping period should be the method used. Be sure and document your efforts when filling out your annual updates for your property. Feral pigs are a major issue across the state. It is often said if you do not have a feral hog problem, just wait a while and you will. The control of feral hogs often involves a comprehensive strategy, often involving a combination of several methods, such as hunting and trapping. Aerial gunning is an effective practice, but is mostly used on larger acreage. When trapping feral hogs, I recommend you document how many days you are pre-baiting the trap, how many days you're setting the trap, and the time period you do this. While there is not an intensity level stated in the guidelines, I believe it is important to document. On the list, you will see toxicants. Texas Parks and Wildlife has been researching a toxicant for feral hogs for several years. The plan is for this toxicant to one day be approved by the FDA for release and sale to the public. I do not know the time frame for this, but once again, when released, this will likely just be one more tool we can use and it will not be 100% effective. Fire ant control is a practice that biologists are asked about quite a bit. There are different views on what effect fire ants may have on native wildlife. It seems the largest effect that most biologists can agree on is the decrease in insect populations that are a food source for many birds. Fire ants likely also cause injury to some wildlife during the birthing and nesting seasons. When choosing a commercial pesticide for fire ants, be sure to follow the labels and make sure to get one that's registered for pasture use. Extinguish Plus has shown to be an effective pesticide when applied 1 to 2 times per year and cost about $15 to $20 per acre per application. Note here that the intensity level is 10% of the designated area in the plan or 10 acres, whichever is more. This is different than the wording in many of the other practices. So here, if you have 150 acres in the plan, 15 acres annually would be the minimum treatment. In summary, the minimum requirements is to complete one practice in 3 different categories annually. It is always best to slightly exceed the requirements in the plan. You can always do many more practices, just don't make the wildlife plan busy. Once you have filled out your plan and corresponding paperwork through your local appraiser, be sure and submit before April 30th. Practices should take place annually between January 1st and December 31st. And lastly, keep good records.